This week on the BackTable podcast.
If you have something and you think it's going to work, you ought to give it a try. I mean, go for it. You know, sometimes it may take you a while, and it's probably going to go a little bit differently than you have it initially conceived. And you've got to be willing to bring people on and work with people and listen and understand, really. But it's fun. It's a fun journey. And I think the fun part of it is to see something that you think can be a benefit and then see it through to where it actually is making an impact in patients' lives. It becomes very meaningful and gratifying at that point. Do it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the BackTable podcast. You can find all previous episodes of our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and at backtable.com. This is Eric Gantwerker as your host this week. We have the folks from iotaMotion here, Marlan and Chris. I wanted to start by asking you to introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about yourselves and how you came to be in the entrepreneurial innovation space.
I'm Marlan Hansen. I'm a neurotologist, which means an inner ear and skull-base surgeon, and I primarily practice out of the University of Iowa. So we do a lot of work around inner ear and especially cochlear implants. And that's kind of what led us to this innovation is we were trying to develop ways to do a better job with cochlear implants than currently. And so that's kind of what led us to this.
Awesome. Chris.
Yeah, I'm Chris Kaufmann. I guess I'm a clinician, engineer, scientist. I grew up in South Texas, have a background in biomedical engineering, did business on undergrad as well as some biochemistry. And so kind of a diverse background that kind of led me through this path that I guess we'll get into here in a little bit. But went to medical school. Prior to that, I worked on drug-eluting stent development down in San Antonio where they developed the first stent. Then went to medical school, did general surgery, and then I matched up at the University of Iowa into ENT. I was in the T32 research resident track. After a year of ENT, I got in the lab working with Marlan. Really, at University of Iowa, was one of the top cochlear implant centers in the country, really the world. And Marlan and Dr. Gantz, really having the clinical perspective, saw a need, and really that's when Marlan and I got together and started developing it.
Awesome. Chris, obviously you had sort of the engineering background. I was also a biochem major, by the way. So I had lots of respect to you. Marlan, for you, did you have an entrepreneurial background or a business background, engineering background, or you sort of really came from the clinical side?
I have not a business background. I have engineering interest, but no background. And my background was really, I have a lab that does sort of basic auditory neurobiology and regeneration, but also a lot of efforts to try and translate what we do to make cochlear implants and other therapies better, and had some ideas around how we might be able to do that, but really didn't have the expertise to do it or other people who had the expertise to work with until Chris showed up. So had some of these ideas way back, we sort of dabbled in them, but really didn't do anything. And then when Chris came, it sort of opened up the avenue that, he had the time and the expertise to work on it. And so we started to work on it together.
Awesome. So, Chris, how did you come from a BME and biochem background and business to robotics and working with Marlan?
Yeah, so I think, as part of NIH fellowship, you have 2 years of really, like Marlan said, dedicated research, which is nice because I think it gives you the time away from the clinical activities, but you still bring the clinical perspective, combine that with kind of engineering, a little bit of business that I'd had previously. I think really what it came down to, like a lot of things, is funding. We got into the lab and Marlan had the idea. We just needed a way to get some funding to help develop early prototypes, start working with some of the cochlear implant companies. And so it all started with an SBR grant. Really, we said, okay, this is something that, can be potentially translated into a company because there's a lot of interest from the cochlear implant space. And there's, for one, just a very big clinical need is really what started it all. And so we applied for that first SBR grant through the NSF, National Science Foundation. We got it our first try. We used those funds while I was a research resident to start developing robotic prototypes to address really the need of improving access to cochlear implants and really standardizing the insertion and minimizing trauma.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think what you guys are doing is really definitely needed because, having done these with actually Dr. Ravi Sami, an old Iowa alum. I know how traumatic it can be, especially when some people like me do it. But, what was the pain point that you were trying to solve for, more specifically, and how did you think that the robot was the best solution?
The issue is you're putting in a pretty big piece of equipment into a very small, delicate space. It really has become quite evident that any trauma you cause has deleterious effects. And it became even more heightened in the era now where, for the past 20 years at Iowa, we have been working on this idea that it's better to preserve whatever residual hearing you have in the ear. And so it became almost imperative to come up with ways to be more smooth, more steady, less traumatic, more precise, and also to make that so that everybody could do it. Because, what I could see is that, there were a handful of centers that would really try and do any structure or function preservation by putting in the cochlear implant. And most places weren't, it wasn't even on their radar screen to do that. And so you had to have something that you could have every surgeon use and use at a high level. And then some of it actually has to do with, what happens if the patient loses hearing or has a change in their hearing status after you put the implant in? Can you adapt it so that you can personalize where the electrode is to optimize it for that individual patient's hearing? And so I think that in a big scheme, to make it a short answer, one, better structure, better function preservation, more consistent results, and more consistent results across a wide experience range of surgeons.
Absolutely. And, obviously this may go across to our ENT BackTable, but, our BackTable innovation audience isn't all ENTs. So, for those who aren't familiar, cochlear implants obviously are an implanted device that goes into the cochlea itself, but not all patients are completely deaf. Some have residual hearing, and that's sort of the population you're primarily talking about with the solution. Is that correct?
Well, we're talking about all patients who receive a cochlear implant, because even those where there isn't measurable hearing, there's still structure and function in that cochlea that's important to preserve. So there's lots of data now that show that if you damage those delicate little structures in the inner ear, you're probably not only causing scarring and fibrosis, but the nerve itself that you're trying to stimulate is injured, and just the overall benefit from the electrode is diminished. So anything we can do to mitigate or reduce damage, even on a micro scale, is probably very helpful for the patient, even if they don't have, of course, if they have residual hearing function, like you mentioned, Eric, but even if they don't have residual hearing function, even if it's a completely deaf ear, there's still stuff in there we need to preserve to help it to work best.
For sure. And typically it's the surgeon who's actually inputting the array into the cochlea through a very, very small millimeter size hole and putting this small electrode in there, which can be quite difficult. So tell me about you had an idea, you got some grant funding. That's very different from building a prototype and thinking about building some kind of product to actually launching a company and raising funds and going that route as opposed to sort of an institutional based. Can you tell me a little bit about that journey?
Yes, I think Marlan kind of alluded to it. We started with, I think it comes down to de-risking a technology to a point where it's attractive to investment. It gives you a little bit of time to kind of assess and iterate and test the market out. Really, we started, honestly, at this sort of wild idea that Marlan alluded to, kind of pie in the sky of, if we can sort of develop a fully implantable robot, you implant with the cochlear implant itself, you can put the implant initially robotically, submicron precision and speeds. And then if the patient's hearing loss declines or progresses, then the technology that we developed was you could transcutaneously access this implantable robotic system and advance the electrode further so that the electrode contacts are exactly where they need to be within the cochlea. And so really back to your question about sort of the pain points, the main reason for this is there's a big fear of loss of residual hearing. And in Iowa has always been at the cutting edge of hearing preservation cochlear implants. And this was a way to kind of overcome that barrier, fear of hearing loss and help to preserve hearing. So you put the implant in a little bit of ways just where the patient needs electrical stimulation, but then they can also use a hearing aid to provide acoustic stimulation to the remaining parts of the cochlea, which is really the best hearing that you can have. And so over time, the problem was that hearing loss can kind of progress, which we know And so we want to be able to progress that implant, advance it further, and really electrically stimulate the structures that have been lost over time with noise or just as we age. And so that's really where we started with this fully implantable system that can adjust an implanted electrode array. And the goal really, I think for me, when it started was just the low penetration rate of cochlear implants themselves. You probably know it. Less than 5% of people who are eligible actually get them, which kind of just blew my mind as a resident and kind of new to the field of ENT. And I think it's just a matter of asking questions like, why is that? And as I sort of dug deeper and deeper and deeper and kind of looked at all the different barriers and all the different pain points, it was, one was fear of hearing loss, which we were addressing. But really it was the standardization of the insertion process itself. Like you said, it's a very complex, we probably picked the most challenging procedure to apply robotics to, but there was your micron level insertion, the structures are, sub millimeter. And so it's kind of beyond the abilities of what a surgeon, the human can do. And so that's really where, that's where I put the two together and said, this is where robotics really has a true clinical benefit in robotics with the true need here that, surgeons can't go submicron speeds. They can't go submicron precision. So let's make something that, fits in the current approach, doesn't add cost, doesn't add significant time. It's compatible with, multiple different electrode arrays across the different implant manufacturers so that we provide access to the most number of patients and potentially improve that penetration rate. So we can treat a big public health problem of hearing loss with cochlear implants.
Yeah. And so when you went through this process, obviously cochlear implants from a company standpoint, from a total addressable market, is a really small market. So as you started to enter into the conversation of, hey, this is a great idea, this is a great product, let's create a company. Did you do market research? Did you see what competitors were in this space? Did you think about monetization, how you're going to grow a company based on a small population, basically, as compared to, something in the other spaces that are more consumer focused or larger populations?
I would say yes and no. We certainly looked at those things, but primarily our motivation was to try and develop something that was going to help and benefit people and say, this is really a need and this is something where we think we can develop something that's we feel like it's really going to move the needle in a lot of ways. And so that was our primary motivation. And I don't know that we were initially in particular that concerned with exactly the market size. We were more concerned about, is this going to work and can it work and how does it help and what's the benefit and what's the outcome? Obviously, as you move down the path, you need to have something that is, you can't just build something and not have it go through an industry sort of phase and get it into the hands of all the patients and all the surgeons that need to do it. And so those are other things that we have been addressing, those other issues. And fortunately, it's looked quite favorable for things. But to say that was the core of what we were doing from the beginning, it certainly wasn't for me. And maybe Chris can tell you what his thoughts are on it too.
Yeah, I know. I think just as clinicians and surgeons with that mindset, you're wanting the best for your patients. You're wanting to improve outcomes and improve healthcare. I think we did look at those factors. Obviously, cochlear implant industry is a multi-billion-dollar market, so that checks that box. I mean, if you look at the low penetration rate of 5%, if you look at the missed revenue opportunities, if you increase the penetration rate, by 1 or 2%, that equates to multi-billion-dollar missed revenue opportunity. So I think it's almost like it's kind of an orphan drug kind of mentality of there's an opportunity here, but we're overall from even a public health perspective missing it both on the public health side as well as the commercial side as well.
Got it. And as you sort of went through that commercialization process, did you have any pushback from investors? I know you've gone through several rounds of investors and raising money, which is fantastic, and obviously a lot of grant funding as well. Has there been any skeptics who said, this is not something, it's a great idea, a great mission, we're not sure about this as a business?
I don't think anyone's really pushed to say this is a bad business idea. I don't think we've heard those. I think, there's probably a little differing ideas about how big of a business it might be. But I think almost everybody who looks at it says, look, there's a need here. This fills a need. And, the way we design this is to really integrate into the natural flow of surgery. So we're not talking about something that's this huge multi-million-dollar investment of a hospital system to get into the hands of surgeons to do just one specific surgery. This is really something that takes the most crucial part of this procedure that's very difficult for human kinetics to accomplish and takes over that part of the procedure or complements the surgeon in that part of the procedure but it doesn't contemplate, it isn't designed to be some big behemoth machine type thing that, takes over. So, it turns out that the economics are actually quite favorable. And so I don't think we've had a lot of pushback on, there's disagreements about what size of market it might be, but everyone, I think, who looks at it says it's a very favorable market.
So, the other thing is obviously, starting this type of idea and working through at a university level, how did you manage sort of the intellectual property, working with, I don't know if there's an innovation arm to University of Iowa, or commercialization or tech transfer? How did that process go for you, and how did that negotiations, or how did those conversations with University of Iowa go?
Yeah, there is, and that's a very good question. So the initial IP that went in on this was filed by the university, as is university policy. So we filed it through the university, and then they strongly recommended, and we agreed that was a good strategy, is to form a small startup company and license that IP from them. And so the initial IP, in fact, that's one of the main reasons to do it is, the university's not going to commercialize a robotic device. So if they want to see the IP move forward, if we want to see the IP move forward, it really does require commercialization type effort. And so, yeah, we negotiated the licensing agreement for the IP through the university, that the university's foundation had. So that's basically how it happened, is they filed some of the initial IP. We negotiated with them what the terms of the licensing agreement for that IP would be. They still have a little bit of say in how the company goes, and a little bit of stuff. They have a percentage of the company as a consequence of that.
Yeah, I'm sure. And how about as the company has grown and your role within the company versus as a clinician? I myself am a part-time clinician. I'm 60% clinical and 40% working for a technology company. And that's a constant battle of trying to, divide myself 30 times into multiple areas. How have you managed working with the company as well as being a practicing and active clinician?
Yeah, I mean, the university has really strong guidance around this. So we have conflict of interest policies and things that we do. And we truly try to make sure it's clean between the university, is very supportive. Our initial office for the little small startup company was actually in university space for, these little incubator type scenarios. So we started there, and, we just keep it separate. I make sure that, my time is separate. We try and make sure that, in fact, all the way through, we have made sure that, university work is done with university things and resources and time, and iotaMotion work and resources are used to develop iotaMotion things. So
totally understand. You're still full-time clinical, right?
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
clinical / administrative / research. So
sure. I
have several research grants that are devoted to things that are not robotic, have a clinical and surgical practice. And then I'm also have an administrative, I'm the department chair, so I have an administrative role within the department as well.
Keeps you really busy. I don't know where you'd produce time, but I'd like to find out. So the other question I had was that, as you sort of grew the company, obviously you had to onboard members to the company. Obviously you had Chris and yourself, but how did you start to build out that team? And how do you plan to continue to do that?
Yeah. So the first person we hired was actually an engineer who Chris knew very well. It's one of Chris's colleagues from back there. And the way we set it up is really through the SBIR, where he would function as the PI on the SBIR. And so then that's how we got the initial support. And then through grant funding and through investor funding, we started to grow and add an employee here and an employee there, depending on what the needs were. We worked with a guy named Eric Timko, who came out of the orthopedic robotic space, and he sort of took over as our chairman and has helped a lot with the fundraising, and he kind of had the contacts that he could go to get some of the initial fundraising that we needed to do to keep things moving forward. Obviously, we have a lot of people who are not just employees, but are consultants. So we use FDA consultants and all kinds of different people, and it's growing. So it's now becoming a much larger operation than just me and Chris and and a bag of ideas.
I think the key is to run it efficiently. So we tried to keep it as lean as possible, leverage our grant funding with the private investment with Eric's help bringing that in. And so with that, I think we were able to be very efficient about it and kind of de-risk it to the different sort of gated phases where, now it's a very attractive point for investment and kind of a scalable kind of hit the gas once you kind of de-risk it to that point. I think the big key for us, obviously, is being the first, FDA-approved robotic-assisted cochlear implant insertion system. So now we're at a point where it becomes a scaling and really commercialization phase.
That's fantastic.
And, Chris was really good in this. And, we had milestones and we just really, like Chris mentioned, I think being small, we were nimble, very efficient, and made really good use of grant funding as well as the other investor funding that we had. So I think all of those things were very helpful to us.
I think it helped us in a way, just the fact that we were able to do what we have done with I guess the resources we have really, getting through COVID with a lot of unexpected, obviously global pandemics, right? We did complete clinical study and submit to the FDA during that time. I think was hard for a lot of startups. Markets were shutting down and hospitals are closing. And so from a medtech perspective, we were prepared for that because of the way we were already set up with sort of these phase gated milestones, really, phase 1, 2, 3, and stick to the plan and execute accordingly, time the incoming funding with the next milestones.
Yeah. You brought up that big gorilla in the room and FDA. I know a lot of people who've gone through this process and they're just afraid of going through the FDA process. But it sounds like for you guys, it actually was pretty straightforward and simple, even though it was during COVID.
Straightforward, yes and no.
We call it straightforward.
Straightforward in a circuitous route, exactly.
It's straightforward once you're on the backside of it, but it's...
yes, exactly.
No, but it went well. We had, I think the FDA, they saw the value, and I think they saw, we had the data. And that's the critical thing is if you have data to support it and if you can show it, and then I think, they were pretty enthusiastic.
Yeah, we had a good team of, consultants. I think that was the other way we've been able to, obviously small team, but surrounded by some of the top consultants in the industry. And so I think that helps for surrounding yourself with some of the expertise that's been there, done that before and been successful in the past. Just helps.
Have you had to go through insurance reimbursement or do you think you'll have to at some point?
Currently, we don't, but I think that's all of robotics face that specific issue. It also was really helpful to us to come out of the University of Iowa, where we already had a lot of infrastructure and a lot of willingness and know-how to kind of be on the cutting edge or be at the tip of the spear of cochlear implants. It really helped to be in that sort of environment. I think it could have been really difficult in other environments. So we were greatly benefited by being at this particular institution with the particular expertise that we have.
So, a lot of people go through this process and hear all of these innovators that have gone through it and just like, it's simple, it's straightforward. Can you talk some about your setbacks and some of your failures along the way and what you learned from that and what you would tell others about that?
There's always little things. And I think part of it is just believing in what you're doing and being a bit persistent and having the right team around you. I'd say one of our biggest challenges came right close to the end, that when we were going for FDA approval, we were, within what we thought was the closing days, if not week, of having FDA approval. And they threw us a curveball out of the blue that we didn't anticipate. And that slowed us down quite a bit. It took months to kind of address that particular issue. And it wasn't necessarily a lot of fun. And it really kind of slowed down some of our timelines and some things like that. So I would say that was the biggest challenge. There's always the challenges around design. It's funny for me to look back and look at some of our early prototypes and some of the concepts that we had, and some were really good and just weren't tractable or doable. And it's been a fun journey. I don't know. You always anticipate that it's not going to be like just a smooth road. So we didn't go in with rose-colored lenses thinking this is going to be just an easy path. We always knew it was going to be a path forward. In my opinion, it's gone much better than I would have anticipated. Maybe that's the pessimist in me, but it really has gone remarkably well.
It's always good to have low expectations, right?
Yeah.
I don't know about that, but it's always nice to be surprised that you can actually do this,
Always had the drive that even if the challenges came up, that we would get together as a team and figure it out. So I think It's probably key, just the strong relationships and trust.
I mean, I think it is a great team. That's the key, is the right people and belief in the system. And that's key.
Having that unified direction and just going. But yeah, again, to answer the question about biggest challenge, I say FDA and kind of the process we went through was obviously it was a de novo. And so they asked kind of an interactive process. And so again, in the middle of COVID, they wanted additional clinical data, which is FDA. And that's what they want to see, the data, like Marlan said. And so we had to kind of get together and figure out how to do that and do a clinical study while hospitals were closing their doors. And so fortunately, we were successful. And again, with kind of the experience and the network and relationships that Marlan and the RSI would have, we were able to kind of go around and get that done.
What has been the reaction from all the cochlear implant companies to your product?
It's been fun to watch. Each one's been a little bit different. At first, I think they may have had, because there are some other robotics technologies that are being conceived and even developed. But I think when they actually got their hands on it, they were just almost floored. And how quickly we were able to get something that worked so well. I think it almost blew them away for the most part. I don't know if that's the right thing, but because we were small, because we were nimble, we were able to move pretty quickly. And I think that surprised them. And I think it surprised them how well it actually works, and that it's a different concept than I think a lot of these other robotics have taken, where, they're doing an access thing and it's just these large arms that come in, and it's actually doing the surgery a completely different way. This is really just integrating in with the natural workflow of the surgery. I think a lot of them thought the way we did is, this, okay, now we see this makes a lot of sense to us.
We'd worked with them kind of in terms of support and electrodes and things like that, but they hadn't really seen their full approach. And once we had approval and started, making the rounds with it and people were really seeing the system, the biggest difference is we were doing it completely different than anybody else was thinking about it. I mean, like Marlan said, they were big robotic systems, take up half the room. They take up a lot of time and training, but we were a single-use disposable system where the robot is, you throw away the robot at the end of the case. Even from the field of robotics in general, it's kind of a novel concept where you have a miniature robotic system that is disposable. I remember going and doing a demo in Europe and just kind of walking in. There was another robot there that they had been doing, and it's taking up a little OR, walking with the briefcase, and you open it up 5 minutes, set it up, and then they're doing the insertion. Everybody's just kind of amazed at how it fits into everything that's there. You don't have to change anything, and you got submicron precision and control.
That's great. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the product itself. So it's implant agnostic, so it'll do any of the electrodes?
It'll do lateral wall electrodes from all the cochlear implant manufacturers. There's a perimodiolar electrode from one of the manufacturers that is inserted with a sheath, and we have prototypes to be able to do that, but it's not yet ready to be used for that particular electrode array.
Got it. So when surgeons are doing the insertion, they can sort of feel that a little bit of feedback when it feels like it's gone in. How does the robot know when to stop? And does it have that sort of force feedback on the electrode array?
So I actually started out in the lab kind of looking at different insertion forces, and that's kind of how the whole system developed. And really what we found is it's the slow insertion speed that actually, the overshoots and decreasing the outliers, that actually decreases the overall forces and causes the high spikes that cause the damage, in the lab at least. In an effort to kind of fit it into kind of the cost perspective plus intraoperative setting and keep it small and miniature and disposable, what we found was that you can actually, with the buckling electrode array, you can visualize the forces, and Marlan can talk more to this, visualize actual forces just by the inherent mechanical properties, as well as there's some built-in sort of hardware-based maximums, I guess, if you will, that kind of limit that.
Yeah, but maybe a point to bring out is actually a surgeon can't sense the type of forces that would cause trauma within the cochlea. If a surgeon is feeling some major resistance, either there's a lot of scar tissue or other things built up in that ear, or you're charging through some things that, and the damage has been done. So it's well below the threshold of what a human can perceive, a human hand.
Which is a huge value, obviously. How about handling atypical anatomy, like a common cavity or something along those lines?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, right now we just limit ourselves to a normal cochlea. It's not to say that in the future it may not we wouldn't also consider using it in malformed or otherwise diseased. It probably would not ever be used realistically in ossified cochlea or cochlea with a lot of scarring in them, but in malformed cochlea there might be. But just to be able to get it launched and to get it into the hands of surgeons and get field use and feedback, we limited it to ears that have normal anatomical radiographic anatomy, at least.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the surgeons. So, we've seen in other technologies as they come to the clinical realm, we've seen fear for some of the technologies, quote unquote, taking over people's jobs. We've seen this in artificial intelligence, in radiology, and dermatology. There's some element of robotics as well. Have you had any pushback from surgeons with regards, this is what I do every day. Why do I need a robot to do this for me?
Yeah, I mean, not much. I mean, there was one surgeon that said something like that.
You don't have to name names. It's okay.
Yeah, there was one surgeon who claimed that he claimed that he was as good, better than a robot or as good as a robot. And actually, it's been fun. We'll have these things at conferences where a lot of surgeons will come by our booth, and they can put them on we can put on a force transducer, and we can let them insert an electrode array, and then we can put it up against the robot, and it can be the John Henry sort of task, and they can see, and we've yet to find the surgeon that wins. So, that there might be one out there. There's one that thinks he is better, but for the most part, this does not take the surgery away from the surgeon. The surgeon still does all of the surgery. This actually enables the surgeon. Like one of our most experienced surgeons using it loves it because it gives him now 2 hands free. It gives him more ability in surgery. It's not only steadier, but he can be more precise and better with it. And so they actually enjoy it. They have fun with it. It's not taking the surgery out of their hands and putting it into something else. The other thing that's important to understand is that they remain completely in control. The way we have this designed to mitigate risk and to really make it work well, we want the surgeon to be in control of things the whole time. So the surgeon's in control of the insertion, and they can go slower, they can stop, they can reverse, they can alter the trajectory by manipulating the array a little bit. So all of those things, I think surgeons actually have a fun time with it. We've almost universally found that to be true.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the other point to bring up, I think, is, patients want, when they're going into surgery, they want the best care possible. I think you're seeing this in other robotic areas of having the tools available, whether it's AI, whether it's robotics, or it's imaging, to, optimize care, optimize the chances of successful outcomes. When most patients are asking for it, the best tools available.
The one other thing that surgeons that I've used it many times, and one of the great things is it enables other technologies that complement what we're doing. So we now use technologies, for instance, that electrocochleography, which is a way of monitoring the function of the cochlea. And so you can now integrate your insertion with these other devices, and you have much more control, much better ability to respond and to deal with whatever's happening if you do these things robotically. And so it makes it, you just feel a lot more comfortable with what you're doing, that you know what's going on. And, you can think of this as like driving a car, I think is a good analogy. And you just go really slow, and, you're not going to cause problems. Even if you do happen to hit a tree, you're not going to dent your fender, if you're going slow. So, it does, though, enable a lot of these other technologies. The other thing that was really fun is, we had a couple of patients where they have hearing in their ear that we're not putting the electrode in, and we do it under local. And so we can be stimulating the implant that we're putting in while we're putting it in robotically, going very slow, and they can tell us how it matches the tones that we're putting in their other ear. So we put a 750 hertz tone in their other ear, and they say, yeah, it's a little bit higher than that. Put another tone in. Now it's getting lower. Now it's close. Yep, that's it. That matches that tone I'm hearing in my other ear. So we can do all of that while the patient's awake and we're putting in the electrode. And some of those things, you just can't do that if you're doing it manually. So it makes it fun for the surgeon.
That's incredible. As we've seen with the other technologies, once doctors and surgeons get past that irrational fear of the technology, they start to realize how it actually may enable them to do their job and may be better for patients. And I think that's universal to all the different technologies that are in this space. What's next for your guys, for your company, for the technology?
Well, there's a lot. So, we're in very much a limited market release where we're just doing our initial few hundred cases and really have a good sense of how it's performing out in the field and what we need to do. We already know of some things that we're doing to improve the next version of it that comes out. And then we have several other complementary and additional technologies that build on top of this. So this is the first thing, and it's going to go from something that does just lateral wall electrode arrays to do all electrode arrays. It's going to move from something where we now integrate it with other technologies, whether it's electrocochleography or imaging or preoperative planning. Like Chris talked about earlier, eventually the vision is that this becomes implanted with the original cochlear implant, and then we can access that transcutaneously or percutaneously while the patient's awake in the clinic, and we can adjust or dial in the position of the electrode array for that individual patient so that we can either move it forward if they lose further hearing, 2 years later, we can move it forward, or if they have a dead zone in their cochlea that's not being able to be stimulated, we can adjust the position of the electrodes. So it personalizes the position of the electrode for individual patients. We're obviously interested in not just cochlear implants, but there's a lot of other medical devices that require similar type precision that are sort of based on the same concepts.
That's incredible.
I would agree. I think it's just from a high level, just continuously improving and kind of continuously learning. I think that's what it's about, and listening to the needs and where the market and headed. So
it's interesting you thought about all the other applications in this space and of your technology. When I came to sort of the technology space, the educational technology space in gaming, I started to pay attention to what the rest of the industry was doing. Have you seen other robotic applications within otolaryngology or other specialties that is interesting or exciting to you that you've been following?
Yeah, definitely. There's some of the technology we're interested in seeing how we can leverage that or integrate that into the things that we're doing. Some of that has to do with planning and trajectory, and there's other robotics that are being used. Obviously the big robotics is used now commonly for some oropharyngeal surgery are now being done robotically. There's other things, other robotic systems where even doing fine manual things, it kind of stabilizes the natural tremor of a surgeon's hand and diminishes that if you're doing really fine micro. So the surgery like a cochlear implant or like microvascular anastomoses or sewing nerves together or something like that require these really fine things. So there's quite a bit of it that's being developed.
We've seen some of the robotic bronchoscopy, and it's always interesting for us because they basically use a game console controller to be able to control the robot. So it's always really funny how things have come full circle a little bit.
Yeah, the gaming industry has actually pushed technology forward a lot faster than some other things have done.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's been sort of where you go for the cutting edge technologies to look where games are. And, movies in the entertainment industry have really tried to push the envelope, and we're trying to figure out how to integrate that back into medicine and medical education. So it's an interesting space and an awesome space to be at. You both have been along a longish journey. We have other entrepreneurs and people who are looking to do product development who listen to the podcast. What would your top advice be to those individuals?
If you have something and you think it's going to work, you ought to give it a try. I mean, go for it. Sometimes it may take you a while, and it's probably going to go a little bit differently than you have it initially conceived. And you've got to be willing to bring people on and work with people and listen and understand, really, but it's fun. It's a fun journey. And I think the fun part of it is to see something that you think can be a benefit and then see it through to where it actually is making an impact in patients' lives. It becomes very meaningful and gratifying at that point. Do it.
Chris, any thoughts?
Well, for me, it was always fun. I think that's the key thing that starts with that. So do something that, doesn't feel like work, but you're spending every hour and every minute of the day doing. Combine that with like a passion and drive. And I think the theme that we've said throughout this is really persistence, because there's going to be roadblocks and you just have to be able to iterate and find ways around it. And if you have that discipline and just keep the purpose and target in mind and the goal in mind, and you'll get there.
Fantastic. Any closing comments? Any thoughts? Anything else about iotaMotion we didn't cover? Anything else that our audience would want to hear about?
No, this has been fantastic. Appreciate the opportunity, and it's going to be a lot of fun to see where things go in the future. And there's so much, and it's fun to be involved in that kind of stuff.
fantastic talking about iotaMotion and both of your journeys along this pathway. And I think our BackTable Innovation audience will be really interested to hear about this. How can they get in touch with you all? How can they find out more about your company?
Yeah, you can go to our website. It's iotaMotion.com, or you can shoot us an email. See Kaufmann at iotaMotion.com and Tim Hansen at iotaMotion.com.
Fantastic. Thank you both for being on the show. This was a true pleasure.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, rate the podcast 5 stars, and share with a friend. If you have any questions or comments, direct message us at _BackTableENT on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter. BackTable ENT is hosted by Gopi Shah
and Ashley Agan.
Our audio team lead is Kieran Gannon, with support from
Caleb Hodson,
Josh McWhirter,
and Ness Smith-Savadoff.
Design and digital marketing led by Brian Schmitz, with support from
Taylor Spurgeon Hess.
Social media and PR by Chi Ding.
Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.